The heat inside the community hall pressed down like a wet wool blanket, and every person crowded onto those hard pine benches had come with the same unspoken question hanging in their throats. Outside, the fields lay cracked and yellow, the creeks nothing but ribbons of dry stone, and every flock in the valley of Coldwater Bend was thinning by the day as men shot their own starving ewes rather than watch them fall. But inside the hall, the air was thick with a different kind of desperation, because word had gone round that the one flock in all the county still fat and healthy and heavy with wool belonged to the quiet woman they had spent 5 years laughing at. Now they waited on her word. Now the price of their winter, the survival of their lambs, the whole future of 100 hardscrabble families rested on what she would say when she rose to speak. Margaret Ellison stood at the front of that hall with her calloused hands folded, and her weathered face still as a held breath, and she let the silence stretch until it hummed. A man in a fine gray coat sat in the first row, with a leather satchel across his knees, wearing the confident smile of a person who has never once been refused. He believed he already knew her answer. He believed he had bought it. He was wrong, and the truth was that the real verdict in Coldwater Bend had been handed down years before, not by any man in that room, but by the land itself, on a freezing night when a half-frozen creature no bigger than a house cat had been carried through the dark inside a threadbare coat. To understand how a woman alone came to hold the fate of the valley, you have to go back to the beginning, back 5 years, to the spring she first drove her wagon down the rutted road into Coldwater Bend with everything she owned lashed behind her and $41 sewn into the hem of her skirt. She had come from the east after burying the last of her people, a schoolteacher's daughter with no husband, no brother, no name that anyone here recognized, and she came looking for cheap land because cheap was all she could afford. What she found was the old Harmon place, 60 acres of stony hillside that no sensible man in the county would touch. Ground so poor and so steep that the last 3 owners had walked off, it broke. The bank at the county seat was glad to be shut of it, and gladder still to throw in the 12 ragged sheep that had come with the property, a flea-bitten little band of scrub ewes, and 1 lame ram that the previous tenant had abandoned as not worth the powder to shoot them. Margaret paid $38 for the deed and the flock together, which left her $3 to her name. And when she signed the papers, the clerk looked at the sum, and then looked at her and did not bother to hide his pity. Sheep, he told her, were a fool's animal in this country, and these particular sheep were the sorriest specimens he had ever laid eyes on. Wool matted and short and full of burrs, frames too small to bring anything at market. A woman alone, he said, shaking his head, ought to have known better than to sink her last dollar into ground and stock that had already ruined stronger folk than her. She thanked him for his trouble and said nothing else, because she had learned young that being right is a quiet business and needs no defending. The men of Coldwater Bend ran cattle, and they ran a great many of them, for the wide grass flats along the river were made for beef, and the whole economy of the valley turned on the price of steers. Sheep they held in open contempt, calling them destroyers of grass and the refuge of people too weak to handle real stock, and a woman who had bought the worst sheep on the poorest ground became at once a figure of easy amusement. When she came into the mercantile that first month for flour and nails, they watched her over their coffee and made their remarks just loud enough to carry, and one man in particular, a broad, prosperous cattleman named Silas Thorne, who owned near 1,000 head and never let a soul forget it, called across the store to ask whether she meant to knit the whole valley a pair of socks. Ha! The laughter came easy, and she took it without flinching, paid her coin, and walked back out to her wagon, and if her jaw was set a little harder than before, no one in that store was watching close enough to see it. She drove home to her leaning cabin and her 12 poor sheep, and she did the arithmetic that would rule her life for the next 5 years, the arithmetic of a body alone against a hillside, so many hours of daylight, so many mouths to feed, so many dollars between her and the frost. The numbers did not add up to survival. They came up short every way she turned them. And at first night she sat on the cabin, step in the dark, and let herself feel, for exactly 1 hour, the full weight of how alone and how foolish she might truly be. But the sheep did not know they were a joke, and the land did not know it either. And in the morning she rose before light, because the work did not care how she felt. She mended the tumbled fences stone by stone with her own hands until her palms cracked and bled and healed and cracked again. She dug out the choke spring behind the cabin and coaxed it back to a thread of clean water. She combed the burrs from the matted fleeces, one animal at a time, holding each frightened ewe against her knees and talking low until it stilled. And in the doing of it, she came to know them, not as a flock, but as individuals, the nervous gray one who bolted at shadows, the greedy black-faced one who shoved to the front at feeding, the old ram with the clouded eye who limped but never complained. The county judged her a fool, but the arithmetic began very slowly to shift, for a hungry animal that is fed, and a matted animal that is cleaned, and a sick animal that is doctored, will repay you in ways that do not show on a ledger for a long while. She could not see it yet. Brr. She only knew that some mornings when she came over the rise, the greedy black-faced ewe would lift her head and come trotting to meet her, and that small daily welcome, that one creature, glad she existed, was for a time the only thing standing between Margaret Ellison and the road back east. The first winter came down hard and early off the northern ridges, and it was in the black cold of that first February that the thing happened which decided everything, though no one but Margaret would know it for years. One of her ewes, the nervous gray one, dropped a lamb 3 weeks too soon in the middle of a killing night, and by the time Margaret found them at the far corner of the fence, the ewe had rejected the tiny creature and moved off, and the lamb lay in the frozen mud no bigger than her 2 hands together, cold as the ground. Its breath so faint, she had to hold her cheek against its muzzle to know it lived at all. Any cattleman in the valley would have left it. It was the runt of a runt flock, premature, half dead, worth precisely nothing on any market that had ever existed. Margaret knelt in the mud and did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic said, "Leave it." Then she unbuttoned her coat, tucked the frozen little body against the bare warmth of her own chest, buttoned the coat back over it, and carried it the half-mile home through the dark, with the wind cutting at her like knives, and she sat up the rest of that night by the stove, with the lamb inside her shirt, dribbling warm milk into its mouth, drop by drop, from the corner of a rag, refusing to let it die out of nothing more than pure, stubborn refusal. Toward dawn the small body warmed, and the little chest rose stronger, and against every sensible expectation the creature lived. She named her nothing grand. She called her Pip, because she was no bigger than a seed. Water to the lamb reached no one, and would have interested no one, and that suited Margaret well enough, for she had learned to bank her small hopes low and quiet the way you bank a coal under ash, to keep the fire through the night, showing nothing on the surface, holding the heat deep where the cold cannot reach it. Pip grew that spring into a leggy, curious yearling, who followed Margaret about the hillside like a dog, and came when called, and stood without complaint to be handled, and there was something in the animal, some deep, uncommon calm, that made even the old ram give way to her at the water. It was in that first hopeful spring that the elder came. Her name was Anke Voss, an old widow from the Low Countries across the sea, who lived alone at the head of the next hollow, with a garden and a dozen geese, and a reputation among the valley men as half a witch, for she spoke to her plants, and read the weather in ways they could not follow and did not care to. She came walking over the ridge one morning with a basket of eggs, and she did not laugh at the sheep. She stood a long while at the fence, watching them graze, watching Pip in particular, and then she said, in her soft, accented cadence, that the young woman had done a wise thing that the whole valley thought foolish. Margaret asked what she meant. The old woman said that the cattlemen fought the land every day of their lives, tearing at it, forcing it, and that the land remembers every wound and gives back only what it is beaten into giving. But sheep, she said, sheep walk light and mend the grass with their own feet and their own leavings, and this poor, steep, stony ground that would break a cow's heart was the very ground a wise flock could heal and be healed by, if only the shepherd would stop fighting and learn to listen. The land does not shout, Aunt Kay said. It only whispers, and it whispers slowest of all to those in the biggest hurry. So you must be patient enough to be still, and still enough to hear. That teaching reordered everything Margaret thought she knew. She had been trying to force her poor ground to feed her flock the way the valley men forced theirs, cramming the sheep onto the best patch until it was cropped to dirt. And Anka showed her another way, entirely. Move them, the old woman said. Never let them stay. Let them graze a slope one day and be gone the next, and let each piece of ground rest long and deep before the flock returns. And the grass will come back thicker each season, and the thin soil will hold the rain instead of shedding it, and in time the hillside that everyone called worthless will grow richer than the flats. It was slow. It was invisible. For 2 full seasons Margaret walked her 12, then 18, then 26 sheep. Across her 60 acres in a patient, endless rotation, opening and closing gaps of stone fence she had built herself, and from the road it looked like nothing at all. Like a foolish woman driving a handful of scrub sheep back and forth over a rock pile. For no reason any Christian could name Silas Thorne, whenever their paths crossed in town, made sure to ask after her socks. But the arithmetic was changing beneath the surface where no one thought to look. For the flock that had thrown almost nothing now threw strong, healthy twins each spring, and Pip in particular proved a marvel. A foundation ewe of uncommon size and constitution, who dropped twins every year and mothered them fierce, and whose daughters and granddaughters carried the same deep calm and the same strong frame, so that the sorriest flock in the county was quietly, invisibly, becoming something the county had no idea existed. The child came in the 3rd year. He was a silent, watchful boy of about 10, named Thomas, the son of a broke tenant family, scraping by 2 hollows over, and he had taken to slipping across the ridges to watch the sheep because there was nothing but shouting and hunger at his own house. He never mocked. He would appear at the fence and stand for an hour saying nothing, and one day Margaret simply handed him a bucket, and from then on he was there most days, and he had a gift for the animals, quick and gentle. And it was Thomas who gave names to half the flock, solemn, careful names. And it was Thomas whose plain company kept the loneliness from swallowing her in the long, empty stretches when no adult in the valley would give her the time of day. He asked her once why she moved the sheep so much when everyone said it was crazy, and she told him what Anak had told her, that the land remembers. And the boy nodded as though that were the most sensible thing he had ever heard, because a child who has watched grief up close often understands the value of patience better than the grown men who laughed. Together they walked the flock, and mended the fence, and pulled the lambs in the cold spring nights, and the hillside greened up a shade deeper each year, and still the valley saw none of it. It was Thomas in a sense who brought the first vindication, though he did it by accident. A drover came through Coldwater Bend that 4th autumn, a hard-eyed stranger from far beyond the valley, who bought wool and mutton for the mills and the mining camps to the west, a man who judged an animal by nothing but its quality and cared not at all whose it was or what the local gossip said. He stopped at the mercantile, and Thomas, buying salt for Margaret with her coin, mentioned in his blunt, simple way that his friend up the Harmon place had the best sheep in the county. The drover laughed, having heard the same men Margaret had heard, but the boy was so sure that the stranger rode out to the leaning cabin to see the joke for himself, he did not laugh long. He walked among that flock, ran his hands down their backs, and buried his fingers in the deep clean wool, and lifted the fleeces to the light. And he looked at Pip and her daughters a long while, and then he turned to Margaret with an expression she had not seen on any face in 5 years. This, he said, was the finest bull clip and the soundest breeding stock he had come across in 1,000 miles of riding, and he would pay her a premium above any price paid in that valley, and he would come back every year, and he would tell every buyer he knew. He paid her in hard coin on the spot, more money than she had seen since the day she signed the deed. And when he rode off, he lifted his hat to her, and Margaret stood in her yard holding that coin and understood that she had at last been answered in the only language the scornful ever truly hear. She said nothing of it in town. She banked it low under the ash the same as everything else, and she used the money to buy more of Anki's kind of wisdom, more fencing, better feed for the winter, a second ram of good blood, and the flock climbed past 60 head, past 90, past 140. And still she wore her mended coat and drove her old wagon and let the valley go on pitying her, because a woman who has been laughed at long enough learns that there is a strange safety in being underestimated, a coal that burns hottest where no draught can reach it. But you cannot hide green hills forever from men whose own grass is failing, and it was in the 5th spring that Silas Thorne finally rode up the Harmon Road himself, and he did not come alone, and he did not come to ask after her socks. For the drought had come to Coldwater Bend, sliding down out of a hard cloudless winter into a spring with no rain and a summer that arrived like the open door of a furnace. And by midsummer the river flats that the cattlemen had grazed to bare dirt for 30 years lay cracked and dead, and the great cattle empires of the valley began, one by one, to die of thirst and hunger on ground they had beaten past all remembering. Margaret's 60 stony acres did not die. 5 years of walking her flock light across the resting land, 5 years of the grass thickening and the thin soil learning to drink and hold the rain, had built a sponge beneath her hills, where the cattlemen had built a pan of baked clay, and when the rains failed, her deep-rooted grass held moisture. The flats had lost the power to keep, and her bank spring coaxed back to life. That first hungry spring still ran cool and steady when every creek on the valley floor had gone to stone. Her flock, by then 250 head strong, and every one of them tracing back through the generations to a half-frozen lamb carried home in a coat, grazed fat and healthy across green slopes, while the whole rest of the county starved. And the sight of those green hills above the dying valley was the first thing that made the men of Coldwater Bend stop laughing. Silas Thorne saw it, and Silas Thorne was a proud man in the ruin of his life's work, watching his 1,000 cattle die by the score. And pride so wounded turns quickly to something uglier than contempt. But he was not the worst of what came up the road that summer. The worst wore a fine gray coat and carried a leather satchel and represented interests far larger than any one cattleman's pride. His name was Halloran, and he was the agent of a great livestock and land consortium out of the city, men who bought up ruined country cheap in times of drought and disaster and swallowed whole valleys into their holdings. And Halloran had ridden into Coldwater Bend, smelling the death of it, and finding to his surprise one green island in the desolation. He came to Margaret's cabin with his warmest smile and his softest voice, and he sat at her rough table and told her he had heard the most remarkable things, that hers was the only sound flock and the only living water in the whole district, and that his company wished to make her a generous offer. He named a sum. It was, he made sure to say, a very kind figure for a lone woman in hard times, more than she could ever hope to earn from such marginal ground on her own. And he framed it all as a rescue, a mercy, a way out for a person clearly in over her head. Margaret listened with her hands folded, and then she declined in a single plain sentence, telling him the place was not for sale, and Halloran's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes went cold, for he was not a man accustomed to the word no from anyone, least of all from a woman alone on a rock pile. He put his hat back on and told her gently that circumstances had a way of changing a person's mind, and that he would call again. He called again, and the offers changed shape, the way a threat does when the first mask slips. The consortium, Halloran explained on his second visit, held the paper on the failing bank in the county seat, the very bank that had sold Margaret her land, and through it now held mortgages on half the failing ranches in the valley. And it was in a position, he said with great regret, to call those debts or forgive them as it saw fit. And it would look very kindly on a district that cooperated with its interests. The meaning was plain. He would ruin her neighbors or spare them, depending on whether she sold, and he would see that the whole desperate valley knew she alone stood between them and relief. And so the rumor came, carried on the dry wind, that the strange woman up the Harmon place was hoarding water and grass out of spite while good families went under, that she was too selfish or too crazed to sell to the men who could save everyone, and the same mouths that had laughed at her for 5 years now cursed her name in the ruined streets of town. It was a cruel and clever poison, and it might have worked, save that Halloran, like all men of his kind, could not resist the arithmetic of his own greed, and greed always counts too carefully and shows its hand. For it was Silas Thorne, of all people, who broke first. And it was Silas Thorne who unknowingly began to turn the tide. His cattle were nearly all dead, and his failing spring had left him with nothing but a handful of orphaned calves, too weak to reach the last dregs of muddy water in his dying stock ponds. And one gray dawn, the proud man who had asked after her socks 100 times came up the Harmon road on a stumbling horse. Then he took off his hat, which she had never once seen him do, and he asked, in a voice broken flat with shame, whether she might sell him a little water and a little grazing to keep his last few calves alive. And he confessed that he could not rightly pay for it, not now, not the way things were. Here was the moral hinge of the whole matter, the place where a person's true nature stands out. Plain against the sky, she had every reason to gouge him. She had 5 years of his laughter to answer, and a drought that made her the only well in a burning country, and the plain, hard arithmetic said, charge him everything he had left, and he would still have to pay. Margaret looked a long moment at the ruined man in her yard, and then she told him to bring his calves up before noon, that the north spring slope had grass, and the spring ran cool, and that they would settle the cost later in labor, an hour's fence mending for an hour's grazing. For she would not, she said, take a man's last coin for water that fell out of the sky, and grass that grew out of the ground and belonged, if it belonged to anyone, to the land itself. Silas Thorne wept in her yard, an old proud cattleman weeping in the dust, and he brought his calves up before noon, and he mended fence beside Thomas the rest of that day, and did not say one word the whole time, except at dusk, thank you. The word of it spread as fast as the poison had. Faster, because a true thing in a hard time travels on the wind like fire, and within a week a steady line of ruined families was coming quietly up the Harmon road, and Margaret turned none away, dealing with each the same. No coin taken for the gift of the land, but a fair exchange of labor for the labor she and the flock had put into making the land worth having. And this, precisely this, was what Halloran of the consortium could not abide, for a woman giving grass away for work destroyed the whole logic of scarcity. His fortune was built to exploit, and so he called a gathering at the community hall to settle, as he put it, the water question once and for all. And that is how the whole valley came to be crowded onto those hard pine benches in the crushing heat, waiting on the word of the woman they had spent 5 years mocking. Halloran rose first and spoke in his warm, reasonable voice, and he was very good at it. And he laid out for the frightened crowd a vision of order of his company, buying the Harmon place and its flock and its water, and managing it fairly for the good of all, distributing the resource sensibly, rather than leaving it to the whim of one untrained woman who might change her mind, or fail, or die. He painted her as fragile and unreliable, a woman alone who had gotten lucky and could not possibly be trusted with the survival of 100 families, and he named again his generous price. And Margaret watched some of the desperate faces begin to turn toward him, for fear is a strong current, and he was rowing it well. Then he made his one mistake, the mistake greed always makes, for in pressing his case he let slip that he knew her flock numbered 250 head exactly, and that her north spring gave better than 11 gallons the minute, and that her east slope alone could carry 60 ewes through August. And these were not figures any man could have from the road or from the town. They were figures got by trespass, by a man he had paid to lie in her stones and count and measure and creep her fences in the dark. And when that too precise arithmetic fell out of his own mouth, the whole hall went still, because every soul in it understood at once that the fine man in the gray coat had been spying on the woman he called untrustworthy. that he had numbered her sheep, like a thief in the night, while calling her the danger. Margaret rose then into that stillness, and she spoke for the first and only time in that hall, and her voice was quiet, but it carried into every corner, the way stillness makes a small sound large. She said she would not sell the place to the consortium, not for his price, nor any price, because the land was not a thing to be swallowed and squeezed, and a well was not a weapon to be pointed at frightened people. She said the grass and the water would stay open to every family in the valley, for as long as she drew breath, at the same terms she had given Silas Thorne, not for the gift of it, which was not hers to charge for, but for the honest work of keeping the land able to give. She said the flock and the spring were not proof that she had gotten lucky. They were proof only that if you stop fighting the land and learn instead to listen to its slow whisper, it will remember your kindness and repay it 100-fold. And that this was a thing any of them could have done, and a thing all of them could do now, together, if they chose the land's patience over the consortium's greed. Then she sat down. The reversal came all at once, the way such things do after long restraint, for Silas Thorne stood up in that hall and took off his hat again in front of the whole valley, and said in a loud, rough voice that this woman had saved his last calves and asked nothing but honest labor for it, while the fine gentlemen from the city had come to sell them their own. Thirst back at a profit, and one by one hats came off all down those pine benches, and the men who had laughed for 5 years turned their faces to Margaret Ellison with something that had never once been in them before, and it looked like shame turning slowly into respect. Halloran saw the current turn against him, and he gathered his satchel and his cold smile, and he told them all they were fools who would regret refusing progress. And he walked out into the killing heat alone, and no man in that hall stood up to follow him, and his power over the valley of Coldwater Bend evaporated, defeated not by law nor by money nor by force, but by one plain act of decency, laid bare against his greed. The rains broke 3 weeks later, coming up dark and heavy over the northern ridges at last, and the valley drank, and the dead flats began slowly to think about living again. And everywhere across Coldwater Bend that autumn men who had run cattle their whole lives came quietly up the Harmon Road to ask Margaret how she had done it, how the ground held, how the flock stayed fat, and she taught them, and Tomas taught them, and Annika Voss, who had known all along, came over the ridge with a basket of eggs and stood at the fence beside the woman who was no longer the foal of the valley but its wisest steward, and she watched the 250 head grazing light across the green healing hills. She said, in her soft accented cadence, that she had told the young woman long ago that the land only whispers, and that the whole valley had spent 5 years too busy shouting to hear it, and that now, at last, they were learning to be still. Margaret said nothing, only smiled, and knelt down where a small newborn lamb was nosing up out of the grass on wobbling legs, the newest daughter of the line that ran all the way back through Pip to a half-frozen creature no bigger than a seed, carried home one killing night inside a threadbare coat by a woman everyone said should have known better. She gathered the lamb up against her chest the same way she had that first winter, and the arithmetic that had once come up short every way she turned it now added, at long last, to more than she had ever dared to hope, and the land, which remembers every kindness and every wound, held the rein, and green, and kept its patient counsel, and welcomed her home.
Well, and according to Ellie, I should definitely be trying out Palia. Oh, there's another Ellie. Hi, Ellie Tectus. Is Pokopia fun? I've had a lot of fun. It's been great. Don't you have work? I do. I do have work in like 4-ish hours, Diet Coke. That's a good point. Honestly, not gonna lie, I completely lost track of time. There's 2 of me. Yeah, Ellie, there's you here on TikTok, and then there's an Ellie on the Purple Lab. Yeah, maybe we'll just finish this one thing, Diet Coke, and then I will call it. We have been streaming for a hot minute. I just put this down and it counts. Because I don't really want to use these, if I'm being completely honest. But we need to do it for the quest. There we go. Okay, that's the food for Glaceon, so that's kind of cool. Huh. What Pokemon do you have? We have like I think 180 something. Nope, 167 Pokemon at the moment, Ellie. Okay, now I have to pick all these up. Because I don't think they look good. Umbreon is my favorite. I do love Umbreon, which we actually already have. They are right here. I need Togepi. I would love Togepi, Manuela. Togepi is a really good one. Do they have an extra part of their name or are they just Ellie? It says Ellie and then in quotes, Tectus. Like it ain't got no busy business being that cute. That's true.